This is Rogue Warrior. PC Gamer called it one of the worst games ever made. The studio behind it had to shut down an entire branch just to stay alive. For some other devs, however, the games were so bad that they wiped them out completely. It's all about crazy lawsuits, entire teams leaving their boss, or even as simple as a failed ad campaign. I'm here to tell you the stories and reasons that led up to these three failures, starting with Daikatana, one of the biggest letdowns in history of FPS games. In the 90s, the FPS genre had just been born, and so far it was mostly great games, specifically made by id Software. But, surprise surprise, one of the men behind the company is the main hero of this story. This is John Romero, the lead designer behind Doom and Quake. He often complained about the lack of creative control in those games. He wanted to explore more cool features, but his partner and lead programmer, John Carmack, was more focused on finishing the game in time. They had a bunch of arguments, and eventually, John Romero gets fired from id Software. But he wasn't too sad about it, as almost immediately after, he opens his own game dev studio, Iron Storm. He even managed to bring some of the old teammates with him. Now, how do you manage this? You're known as a godfather of the genre in the FPS community, lots of respect and hopes, and you have your own studio with loyal members. Well, you're gonna make a great comeback FPS title, of course, and that's what John Romero wants to do. He announces Daikatana and promises an impressive release date of December 1997, just 1 year after he left id Software. He actually has a promising idea, a story revolving around time travel, a Japanese samurai setting, and even advanced AI teammates, almost never seen before in FPS games. But there's something standing in the way. A $2 million penthouse office in a Dallas high-rise, endless clashes among the top members, and an interesting marketing campaign, which we will discuss later. Spoiler, John Romero regrets it to this day. He has been known to be overly ambitious, which made the id duo work so well. Romero wants, Carmack balances out, and you get the perfect middle ground. But now, there was no limit, and Romero has really got used to it. When the game was around 50% done in August 1997, coming close to the promised release date, he saw a Quake 2 demo. Impressed by it, he suddenly decides to switch Daikatana's engine to the Quake's 2 engine. Chasing technology is great, but it meant throwing out most of the work and doing it all over again. Nevertheless, he still goes for it. The 1997 deadline got missed. In fact, Iron Storm had only gotten the new engine by February next year. Meanwhile, Quake 2 by Carmack comes out around the promised Daikatana's release date. It gets great reviews. While id Software continues to make great games, John Romero can't seem to control the development of Daikatana. The team has arguments that often end with someone getting fired or just living on their own. Romero replaces them with obviously incompetent Quake fanboys, developers on side. In fact, by the year 2000, after the game had missed 2 more deadlines, the Iron Storm team went from 50 members to just 2. Most of the developers just moved to a different branch that Romero didn't control, or left Iron Storm whatsoever. Despite being in development for so long, Daikatana's technical progress stopped in 1998. By its release in April 2000, the game was still using an already outdated Quake 2 engine, and didn't offer anything new. In fact, it wasn't even polished. It was an utter disappointment, with Romero losing all of his hard-earned reputation. Funnily enough, people said that if Daikatana had been released in 1997, it would probably do fine, but selling a 1997 level game in the year 2000 just couldn't work. But what's up with that marketing campaign I mentioned? Well, it's one of the most infamous ads in gaming's history. It's considered to be a big reason behind Daikatana's bad reception. This ad was proposed by a marketing agency that Iron Storm had hired. Even Romero wasn't sure about it, but he was unfortunately pushed by his management colleagues. Check this out. Yeah, the fans really didn't like this one. Besides the insane arrogance, a big factor is that Daikatana isn't even shown in any of the material. It's 99% using the big names behind the game, and 1% the actual game. That 1% was E3 demos that were so bad that they ran at 12 FPS. The backlash was crazy. Romero had apologized many times for this ad, regretting it to this day. Iron Storm was closed soon after Daikatana's release. It sold 40,000 copies, out of 2 2.5 million projected. Interestingly, the second branch of the studio was doing significantly better. It ironically stands behind the first Deus Ex, one of the best games ever made. But it wasn't enough to cover up Romero, who never got to making anything great ever again. But he isn't the only person with some engine switch shenanigans. In fact, he's the lucky one, at least if you compare him to Silicon Knights, who ended up losing a hilarious lawsuit against Epic Games. Spoiler, Silicon Knights were the ones suing the other. Two Humans story starts in 1999 as an announcement for PlayStation. It was planned to be an ambitious, epic sci-fi game. The studio could be trusted, as in 1996 they've actually made the iconic Legacy of Kain. However, on the inside there had already been issues. To be specific, the habit of filing lawsuits was born then. They were in a clash with their publisher, Crystal Dynamics, over who actually owned the IP for Legacy of Kain. Crystal Dynamics went on to make a sequel to it without Silicon Knights. It resulted in a lawsuit, implying that they used story concepts invented by Denis Dyack and his team. They've eventually settled, leaving the IP ownership to Crystal Dynamics and parting ways. While it was a stain on their history, Silicon Knights still end up getting a golden deal with Nintendo. They go on to develop multiple great games for them, such as Eternal Darkness and even a Metal Gear Solid remake for the GameCube. Dyack often bragged about his partnership, saying him and Nintendo were inseparable. Now, to be fair, his games were doing pretty well, which served as the base for that arrogance. But all that Nintendo love quickly diminished. Silicon Knights were once again working on Two Human, now with Nintendo. That was up until Dyack found out that they want him to make the game for Nintendo Wii. He wasn't happy with the console's powers. Besides that, he complained about the lack of control in his other games for Nintendo. So, he suddenly drops the unbreakable ties with them and re-signs with Microsoft. Now, in 2005, Two Human was set to be released on the Xbox 360. Surprisingly, it wasn't just one game. They've also announced two sequels straight away. Now let's be real. Business-wise, this Nintendo ditch move is pretty bad, but objectively speaking, Dyack wasn't necessarily wrong. If you wanted to make a super ambitious game like Two Human, you had to have something like Xbox 360 as the platform. So, if the game is as good as promised, maybe the deal switch was the right move that would push the studio forward. But, as you can understand, there is a reason I'm talking about this game in this video. Two Humans development was never going well. In the end, it's been an on and off project for almost 10 years, with constant resets and technology switches. But the real disaster struck after choosing Unreal Engine 3 as the game's engine. At the time, it was still in development. Epic Games were giving out early access licenses to some studios. They've promised to release updates as they work on the new Gears of War, and they did just that. Unreal Engine's progress was quick, with some studios already releasing games with it. Anyone but Silicon Knights. You see, as the industry was going into the early HD period, the development process had changed a lot. Costs were higher, productivity wasn't on the same level, games were just harder to make. Most studios managed to pull through, but Silicon Knights weren't one of them. But instead of getting their stuff together, Denis Dyack decided to do something different. He went whining all over the press about Epic Games and their incompetence with Unreal Engine 3. He implied that they lacked documentation, communication, and that the engine just sucked. He even developed a conspiracy theory. Apparently, Epic Games intentionally delayed updates and didn't fix issues reported by other studios. All of that to gain an unfair advantage with Gears of War. While others struggle with the engine, the owners use all its benefits to release a great title. What a great way to beat the competition, isn't it? It might even sound believable, except that other studios were releasing games. It was just Dyack having all these issues. Nevertheless, he still doubles down and switches the engine mid-development. Now it was an engine built in-house, which of course meant huge issues. When the E3 demos for Two Human came around in 2006, they had an incredible amount of bugs and were badly optimized. And besides that, the game just sucked. Combat was bad and the story wasn't too good. But Dyack just had to make the matters even worse. He goes back to his oldest ways and files a lawsuit against Epic Games. Now check this out. Not only all of the claims get rejected in court, but Epic Games also countersued them for $9 million. As it turned out, license-wise, Otherwise, Epic Games followed the contract with no issues. But besides that, Silicon Knights were caught stealing Unreal Engine's code for their own engine. Every single counterclaim by Epic Games was approved. This meant a $9 million fine, as said before, and SK also had to destroy all remaining copies of 2 Human. It didn't really mean anything though, as the game couldn't even sell 1 million copies in 4 years. But it's still incredibly hilarious. Obviously, the studio had to shut down shortly after this disaster due to bankruptcy. Dennis Dyack went from a golden Nintendo partnership to one of the most shameful disasters in gaming's history. But if we're talking about shame or bizarreness, none of this comes close to Rogue Warrior. That game is beyond bad business decisions. It had the perfect circumstances to become one of the worst games ever made. The story begins with Bethesda, who had just went super big with Oblivion and soon Fallout 3. At the same time, series like Splinter Cell and Rainbow Six were gaining popularity. Bethesda, now having a bunch of money, wanted to jump into the trend with their own new franchise. The plan was simple. In 2006, they hired Zombie Studios to make a tactical shooter for them. To make it unique, they built it around Richard Marcinko, a former Navy SEAL commander. He was somewhat known for his series of books, talking about his war experiences. On paper, it doesn't sound too bad. Zombie Studios, however, decided to put the game's focus on innovative multiplayer. It was supposed to have more than 200 map variations, 24-player lobbies, a ranked mode and co-op operations. But after a couple years in development, Bethesda scraps the entire project. They said they were unhappy with the direction of the game, so they stopped partnering with Zombie Studios and instead hire Rebellion Studios. This move might be one of the worst calls in gaming's history. There are 2 issues here. Firstly, Rebellion weren't known for high quality games. In fact, it's the opposite. They focused on quick and cheap production, usually for games based on movies or books. Bethesda thought that Rebellion was their only way out of this situation. In the end, the deadline was missed by nearly 2 years. You had to make something and do it fast. But the second issue is Bethesda themselves, specifically their wants for this project. They wanted the game to focus on Marcinko's personality, but he was known to be that Rambo badass type of guy, often lying and exaggerating scenes in his books. Bethesda thought it was a perfect fit for some blockbuster game for 12-year-olds. That's what they wanted Rogue Warrior to be. This approach, cheap developers and a tight deadline, resulted in one of the worst FPS games ever made. Everything about it sucked. The gameplay was clunky, focusing on flashy takedown animations. Storytelling was built around edgy phrases, voiced by some wrestling star who had nothing to do with voice acting for games. The story itself was bad and more of a dictionary of bad language. The innovative online modes were cut and replaced with the most bare-bones multiplayer possible. In general, the game could be described as so bad that it's good. But of course, it's nothing more but sarcasm. There were no actual good reviews for this game. The 12-year-olds would love this idea that Bethesda believed in didn't work out. One of the main reasons being that no 12-year-old ever said that they want this. In 2009, when this game came out, you had stuff like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, Assassin's Creed 2, Bayonetta, Borderlands, Prototype, Minecraft, and a lot more great games. A game with Marcinko as the hero, let alone bad gameplay, just couldn't compete with anything that year. Pete Hines, who was responsible for marketing at Bethesda, later said that not every game has to be your best gaming experience. But if you're making a game with this in mind, what else do you expect rather than Rogue Warrior? It obviously didn't sell that well. Rebellion later blamed Bethesda for the disaster. Considering the narrative they pushed, I get it, but if we're being real, it's not like they could make it much better. Even if Zombie Studios weren't dropped, which was a horrible move, it would still likely be a bad game. Richard Marcinko just wasn't a good protagonist. The Rogue Warrior that came out is actually a perfect representation of his books. I am assuming that Zombie Studios wanted to avoid this, which is why they've tried to focus on multiplayer instead of story. However, despite the disastrous game, both Bethesda and Rebellion are still doing fine. Rebellion did have to close down an entire branch to keep going, but soon managed to score big with the Sniper Elite series. But you have to remember an important thing here. Rebellion never positioned themselves as ambitious experts, especially compared to our previous cases. They were just a quick and cheap game studio. It just happened to be the worst game they made, and it's not like you really expected a masterpiece. Bethesda, on the other hand, was just big enough to not care, although Rogue Warrior definitely left a stain on the history of both companies. You just can't get away with it completely completely after creating such a thing. Although it's still funny that the studio with objectively the worst game out of the 3 is the only one who got out alive. So here we have it. Those are textbooks on how you don't operate a gaming company. Arrogance, unrealistic ambitions and greed destroy games and studios behind them. And it doesn't matter who you once were, even the best of the best can still make the worst of the worst games.
Miss me, motherfuckers? Suck my balls, my hairy fucking big balls, wrap them around your fucking mouth.